There's a little under 2 minutes left in the 2010 AFL Grand Final. Collingwood, the best team across the season, hold the slimmest of leads against the St Kilda Saints, a team that is also there. Collingwood, while not dominant, have led almost all day. Nick Riewoldt takes a solid mark well away from his usual home in the forward line. He bombs it down the line where Lenny Hayes finds it. He dumps it into the Saints forward line. Stephen Milne, one of the greatest small forwards of all time, battles with Ben Johnson, a more than capable defender. The ball bounces on its point, spinning off at a stupid angle. Johnson is beaten and stumbles his way to the bar in Bay 13. Milne, though, keeps his footing and shapes up to collect the ball. This is it. He is about to right the wrongs of history for a team that's seen so much misery, heartbreak and irrelevance. Supporters of all 14 other clubs jump up, begging for Milne to finish off the hated Collingwood. This is as good as it gets. This is as good as it's ever going to get. And believe me, it's been pretty bad for the Saints. Over the next 3.5 hours of content, I'm going to show you exactly how bad they've had it for the 137 years before this day. And by the time I'm finished, if you don't love these chuckleheads, there's probably something wrong with you. Football in St Kilda has its roots in the very origin of the sport. St Kilda FC was the very first football club ever founded in April of 1858. They didn't actually play an official game for a year, but helped found the Melbourne Rules, the first universal Australian rule set. The first match of football that was ever played, though, was on the St Kilda foreshore, between St Kilda Grammar School and Melbourne Grammar, the same Melbourne Grammar who would play Scotch College in the first official game of Australian rules ever. St Kilda had actually beat the Scotchies to that record by 2 whole months. Football in St Kilda would migrate to Alpaca Park in what's now Albert Park, named for the paddock of alpacas because apparently people in the 1850s had no sense of imagination when they named places. In 1864 it was described as the best ground in the city, and this is where St Kilda FC played, starting with their first game in 1859. They're not these guys though, not entirely at least. A dispute meant they lost the use of Alpaca Park in 1865, and their best players went to South Yarra FC, who'd played St Kilda in the second match that St Kilda had ever played. South Yarra were quite good immediately after getting this surplus of good players, but their skipper passed away in 1866, and they were never really the same after that. The arse fell out of them, and they disbanded in 1873. All their best players went to a new club that had been founded in April of that year. Yep, this is the one. So already the St Kilda flag was hoisted upon a pyre of dead clubs, and with a rapidly growing membership, looked to build its foundations upon this cursed burial ground. Sure enough, bad luck came to them almost instantaneously. Their first senior match was a loss. Yeah, shocker. University, also playing their first senior match, scored 1 goal from a fellow named Anderson to win what was without a doubt a terrible contest. The Australasian did remark though that St Kilda had good potential. If only they knew. A match in Bendigo saw only 12 players show up, and another match ran an hour and a half late because the ball exploded as it was being pumped up before the game. Witnesses of the incident recall seeing a young Tom Brady taking notes. The club then took in another carcass to its rapidly filling basement cemetery, amalgamating with University. Yes, that University. As one of 5 clubs in the Metro Victorian area, they became foundation members of the area's football league and body, the VFA. As founding members, they were given senior status for about 2 years. They flat out didn't show up against Essendon in 1879 in what would become a recurring theme for the next 130 years. They were demoted to junior membership and didn't return to senior status until 1886. They sucked. Also in 1879, they complained that the MCG surface was too hard and refused to play. Imagine what they'd think of Metricon these days. God help them if they went to the Etihad. So, a hot minute has passed. It's about time for another club to be conked in the head and dragged into St Kilda's thatch hut. Ah yes, Preran, come on in. Give us all your best players and don't ever wake up. That's a good sport. This merger saved the club, giving the Saints their first season with a win rate better than 1 in 3, as well as giving them Preran's blue shorts that I think we're all thankful they gave up, even if it took them to 1909 to fully burn those things. Ugh. We've already established that history doesn't do reruns, rather it tries similar things but with different ingredients. So in 1891, when St Kilda's opposition rocked up with 12 players because the rain was coming down sideways, St Kilda sympathised. They, along with their opponents in Footscray, wanted the game called off, but the umpire wouldn't have it, and so St Kilda was forced to batter the Dogs 10 goals 5 to nothing. It would be their biggest win, and remain so for decades. Only 1908. Well, considering how the next 20 years turned out, that's actually a shock. But we'll get there. 1892, St Kilda gets a 50-50 win ratio for the first time. In the modern game, they would finish roughly halfway up the table with that kind of record. Of course, this being St Kilda, they finished 9th of 12. Even by 1894, only 20 years into their history, the Saints had built up a firm loser's reputation. The Australasian had this to say about them. 2 classes of men play football. With one, the pleasure of participating is more than sufficient recompense for defeat. The other class thinks the win is above everything else. To the first class, I think those happy, genial Saints belong. By the mid to late 1890s, the richer clubs in the VFA wanted more control and were opposed to equal sharing of gate receipts or some communist thing like that. Yeah, fight those communists! It didn't matter really, as St Kilda weren't concerned. They were just some little basket case of a club that was lucky to be alive, playing next to some alpacas who couldn't even be asked to fuck each other, and that was even if St Kilda could even be asked to turn up and play. Somehow, and I honestly don't think St Kilda knew why, the rich boys invited St Kilda to come along and play in their big boy breakaway league. The Saints weren't rich, and with a win rate of 30% and only a single top 4 finish, they weren't really successful in any way. They weren't all that popular, they weren't really a legacy club, they'd married with clubs like Zsa Zsa Gabor, and they were geographically isolated. But get the invite they did, and who would they be to turn it down? And so it was. From 1897, St Kilda would join the VFL. 1896 was the last season St Kilda played in the VFA, and they did stuff all. Apparently the St Kilda side again failed to show up for a game, with stories of players skiving off against Collingwood to go watch the races. I guess after all these dead horses were flogged for all they were worth, the St Kilda boys wanted to see some live ones flogged, and fair enough. Still, compared to their early years in the VFL, stuff all may as well have been a Premiership Cup. St Kilda lost their first VFL game. And their second. And many, many, many more after that. Well, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. St Kilda failed to win for 3 years. Carlton were also dragged in to be the whipping boys for the rich kids, but at least they won games in the 19th century. And in 1899, St Kilda set new heights in sucking. In an era where the best teams struggled to get past 5 goals and where kicking 10 goals was considered a thrashing, they let 4 teams kick 100 points against them. Geelong, in the final match in 1902, gave a checked-out St Kilda the ultimate thrashing. 23-24-162 to a single, solitary, lonely, sad behind, whittling the beleaguered cellar dwellers percentage to 23.2, a mark half that of the winless, half-killed-in-war university sides of 1913 and 14, and a mark no other side has come remotely close to. St Kilda did kick off the 20th century with a first-up win, but that win was a draw that was repealed under protest. Melbourne had scored a point after the three-quarter time bell had rung. St Kilda appealed, the point was taken away, and St Kilda had their first win, a 1-point victory against the eventual 1900 premiers that carried a small but noticeable asterisk, as did that premiership as a matter of fact, jeez. Their first win outside an appeals court came in 1901. Their second came in 1903. It's hard to put into words how much St Kilda really did suck during this time. They were getting their asses kicked so hard their balls burst, literally in one 1902 game. That year they finished 7 games behind the next worst team, despite having the league's leading scorer. The next season they got their first away win in 10 years. In 1904, the Carlton made the grand final. Remember Carlton? The team given clothes by the Melbourne Redlegs, invited to this league just so they could be thrashed? They were handing out pity goals to St Kilda now, who were at least honouring their part of the bargain still. For now, at least. Of course, this being St Kilda, Joe Hogan missed every single chance at a charity goal. St Kilda were beyond a joke, even this early in the VFL's history. But things were about to change. Hogan was proclaimed as a leader, and a fine one. He was one of only 2 saints deemed worthy of a mention in the famed footballer's alphabet piece. And despite him being as allergic to charity as a conservative politician, he was a fine player, and one of a few men who helped turn the club around. One man, though, played a greater role than anyone. In 1904, a man named Harold Cumberland performed some sleight-of-hand magic tricks at St Kilda's general meeting. His greatest trick, though, was this. In 1902, St Kilda had no wins. In 1903, they had some wins, thanks to the skillful rucking of Vic Cumberland. He would leave the Saints multiple times, but whenever he came back, St Kilda became good. He was that critical. Without him, this story might well end right here. Other recruits joined him, such as Vic Barwick and captain coach Dave McNamara, and 1906 marked the first time they dodged the wooden spoon in consecutive years. Cumberland and Big Dave were both considered the best players in the colony at various points in the 1900s. These improved results also came with their second protest of a result against Melbourne, but this time it didn't stick. It would also happen again in 1928. Actually, speaking of that first protest, one man who'd made his debut on that day in 1900 was Claude Clough. What's interesting about him, you ask? Well, he wasn't a man. Not really. He made his debut at 15 years, 209 days. That day also becoming the league's youngest ever goalscorer. As the rules currently stand, this record is impossible to get within 2 years of, bar some birth certificate fraud. It would be his only win, as his next 22 games were all losses, before hanging up the boots after 1901 and sinking into obscurity. So if you feel ever bad about yourself, just know that at least you didn't retire before you drunk your first beer. That win that Clough was a part of, though, wasn't the first time this club had seen controversy around scoring in a match against Melbourne. In 1866, South Yarra won the Challenge Cup, the biggest football competition at the time, by beating Melbourne. Their winning goal, though, wasn't a goal. You might think Melbourne deserved penance for that they would draw revenge. They wouldn't. Those failed appeals were the closest that they got. But the football gods would punish the Saints for this way down the line. And we'll get there. For now, let's get back to that cup. In typical St Kilda fashion, the cup was abandoned and thought lost, until it turned up in Bristol of all places in 2007. It was almost like St Kilda couldn't be trusted with success for a while because of this. Nonetheless, they had a crack at it. They even made a couple of finals runs, but were completely embarrassed in both finals they made, both times against those other whipping boys, who won the premiership on both occasions. And hooray, there goes the wind from their sails, with merger ideas again being floated about. Time to pick up players that Carlton objectively stated aren't good enough for them, like the true bottom feeders that they are. Like, honestly, 1907 should have been their year. They won their first 6 games, and remember, it took them over 120 games to get their first 6 wins, rounding off that run by scoring 100 for the first time. Alas, they remembered they were St Kilda. A train delay meant their match with Geelong finished in the dark, allowing the Cats to overwhelm them with 10 fewer scoring shots. That was the last game of the season for Harry Lever. The fullback, who would go on to be the Seasiders' first 200 gamer, had lost 2 fingers in a bandsaw accident the morning before, and he still played against the Cats. What a boss! The Saints went 7 for 3 with a fully fit Lever, and went 2 for 6 without him. Oh hey, remember how they used to do really stupid shit that cost them games? Well, playing against Geelong in 1909, they played William Billy Ginger Stewart in their lineup for his 43rd game and 6th of the year, but he'd been suspended after an incident playing for Bendigo. St Kilda knew of this, but thought the suspension didn't count in the VFL as official word hadn't been given to the league. So, despite winning a game in a thrilling finish and in a legal manner to their own knowledge, St Kilda would dock the premiership points for it, which would prove the difference in the battle for last place. Oh, the lawyer arguing for their defence, by the way? This guy. Unbelievable. And believe it or not, that wasn't the worst thing that would happen to them in 1909. The players had a bust-up with the committee and lost some of their best stars, including Big Dave McNamara. But St Kilda had a new star about to rise. Ernie Sellers debuted against an amateur university side caught in a league that was rapidly becoming professional. He scored 7 on debut, outshooting the students by himself and setting a record for goals on debut that would stand until World War II. Unfortunately, as we discussed in the Kent Kingsley video, big hauls on debut doesn't guarantee a successful career. It would be the biggest haul of the 170cm, 66kg forward's career before moving to Perth in 1914. 1911 brought a players' strike over paying conditions, as St Kilda had been caught on the back foot in the league's attempts to professionalise itself. The committee, feeling backed into a corner, suspended the strikers, including their former captain, as well as club icon Wells Ike and his dad. And you're gonna think I'm joking when I say that it was the best thing to have happened to the club so far. But look at what they'd done to this point. A meteor destroying their oval would be an improvement on this rubbish. The strike forced 15 new players with a combined 46 games experience onto the field to get shredded against Carlton and rampantly get done in for the rest of the season. Most never played again, but one of them was an 18-year-old by the name of Roy Kazali. Yeah, that one. Teaming with Vic Cumberland in the ruck whenever he wasn't being a footy missionary in New Zealand, the two would provide a handy spine for the Saints to build on. The players on strike came back and immediately the Saints improved. 2 wins became 7. 7 wins became 11. And thanks to South inaccuracy and 6 goals to Ernie Sellers, the Saints won their first final in 1913. They'd won their way through to their first final, with a capital F. Kazali kicked 3 goals as the Saints led from the start to claim their first premiership. The sudden success after 16 years in the doldrums was a shock for all. But it didn't matter. The Saints were champions. Wait, what was that? Oh, you're kidding. How do I explain this? Melbourne's dumb and farcical 1900 premiership had necessitated a complete rethink of the final structure. The solution they came up with was simple and effective, everyone thought, except Geelong. The VFA club argued that the minor premier deserved an advantage for finishing top, and that the Final Four system was too equal. Bloody communists. Yeah, fight those communists. A compromise was reached. The minor premier had the right, should they lose any finals game, to challenge the eventual winner of the final, capital F. This challenge match would be called the Grand Final. So Fitzroy used their right as minor premiers to challenge. The The Saints, though, were still earmarked as quality contenders. They'd scored more than Fitzroy that season and were the most accurate scorers. But Fitzroy had a weapon: their razor-sharp defence. They'd conceded less than 6 goals per game in 1913, and in the first half of the grand final they showed exactly why. The Saints became only the second side to fail to score a goal in the grand final half, and the most accurate side of the season crawled into the final break having scored 1 goal 10. Somehow though, they were only 4 goals down. They scored the first of the last quarter and set about to work. When George Morrissey goaled with a few minutes to play, the margin was down to 2 points. The Roys were in trouble. They'd lost complete control of this game. Again, the Saints surged forward, finding Des Baird, who marked about 10 metres out. Apparently. Now, stories vary about exactly where everyone was here. Some accounts say Des Baird was in the goal square. Others say he was just within range, which could honestly be anywhere around here. Wherever he was, he marks it. 24 years later, St Kilda's Bob Bowden would reveal that Baird had a leg injury at that point. This slowed him down and Fitzroy's defenders got back to cover him. One man they didn't cover though was George Morrissey. Reports vary over where he was as well. Bowden says he was on a tight angle, but Baird himself said he was dead in front. Meanwhile, Roy Cazaly thought that George was Vic Cumberland, so that's the sort of bullshit I'm dealing with here. I'm gonna go with Baird's version for a lot of this. Anyway, Baird, in what must be the first ever recorded Joe the Goose pass, hand passes it to Morrissey. According to Bowden, the handball was a mongrel. According to Cazaly, the handball was intercepted and taken up the other side of the ground, so I have no idea what to actually think. But according to Baird, George has time to steady. He doesn't steady though. He panics, and from a handful of yards out, with the grand final on the line, he shoots. The Saints have led grand finals in every year they've made them, except for one. Believe it or not, this is that one. Morrissey was already manned by an opponent, rushed his shot and missed. This muffed pass, which, and I don't think I can stress this enough, was inside their goal square, would be St Kilda's final score, as the Maroons extend the margin from 1 to 13 with 2 late goals. But hey, there was always next year, right? Ah, crap. Some decent results across the next few years, including sparking a riot from Carlton fans because they beat them, were a lie, as the world was overshadowed by the Great War. So were the Saints, actually. St Kilda gave its players, some in turn giving their lives, in a pissing contest between two empires thousands of miles from home. St Kilda lost so many players that they had to sit out of the VFL for almost the entire length of the war. And that wasn't the only way in which the war affected them. Since their VFL debut, the Saints had worn red, black and white. Unfortunately, these happened to be the same colours of the German Empire. Oops. So much like Melbourne's coach at the time, they had to change to something a little less Heinzy, and they picked 3 colours the Germans would never ever use: yellow, red and black, in support of Belgium, where a couple of the Saints players were fighting. And it looked shit. They changed to a less bad but still odd V configuration, and later a K pattern, which, and this is true, ew. The Germans changed their flag after losing the war to... that's awkward. 3 years afterwards, the Saints changed back into their traditional garb, into a colour scheme the Germans would never use again, for God's sake. The 1923 jersey brought a new stripe configuration that resisted any future war-inspired colour change. Although the rear and sleeves of the jersey would see alterations, the iconic 3 stripes would remain their home kit for the next 74 years. The fashion show wasn't the only exciting thing that would happen for the Saints in the 15 years following their grand final heartbreak. While they were deciding who the hell they were, South Melbourne decided to put 17 goals past them in the final quarter alone, in doing so orchestrating the only 100-point quarter in VFL-AFL history. The Saints only had 15 men on the ground due to injury, and reportedly more just flat out left towards the end. Some things never change, eh? In round 11 in 1921, they had 18 scoring shots to Fitzroy's 14. Fitzroy scored 6 goals. St Kilda scored 0. Ever the enigmatic performers in front of goal, in 1922 a Saint produced something special. You remember Big Dave, right? Well, he's back, in Poggers form. Despite the 1909 hullabaloo, St Kilda was still the club McNamara loved. He tried to get a transfer there from the Essendon Dreadnoughts, what a cool fucking name, in 1913, but was knocked back for no apparent reason. He got his ticket back to the league in 1914, replacing the outgoing Ernie Sellers. David John McNamara was back. And in the last 2 years of his career, the man in his mid-30s took footy to a level never seen before or since. Round 17, 1922. Dave McNamara scores 10 goals from 12 kicks, including 2 place kicks of over 65 yards. The next week, McNamara kicked 1 goal 13. Odd, frustrating, and typical St Kilda. But it's not what he's remembered for. Round 3, 1923. Some 18 years after his debut, the oldest man on the ground by over half a decade unleashed a weapon of a place kick from 75 yards, scoring a goal. He one-upped himself, scoring 6 points from 84 yards in the last term. And, most audaciously, he attempted a shot from 93 yards. It missed, but remains the longest recorded kick in VAFL history. It was his final year as a player and a coach, with his last game being a showdown against Roy Cazaly to determine the last finalist, which, of course, St Kilda lost. Don't worry, he'll be back though. Another couple of wooden spoons joined their collection after McNamara left, with George Sparrow's return as coach marking the 19th coaching change in 22 years, with new captain Roy Cazaly leaving to join South Melbourne, citing internal politics and infighting, where he'd go on to do the things that actually put him into folklore and the AFL Hall of Fame. But Cazaly's impact at St Kilda goes beyond skippering a last place side and kicking 3 in their first Capital F final. In 1919 he began his coaching career at South Warrnambool Bull. While there he saw a talented halfback in Colin Watson, whom he brought to St Kilda. Watson developed into a fine midfielder and, in 1925, won the Brownlow Medal, St Kilda's second ever prize that wasn't for finishing last. Of course, this being St Kilda, he found himself a job installed days after winning the medal. He was offered their team's role as captain and coach as well, which he accepted, but the Saints didn't. They denied him clearance, forcing him to take a year off. He got the same offer from Maryborough for 1927, and the Saints again denied him clearance. Sick of sitting out, he played anyway and won the flag, earning himself a 3-year disqualification from VFL football. He would eventually return to the Saints for a brief period, even coaching them for a season, but the way they treated their first champion was peak St Kilda. Before the 1929 season though, they would hire a man to play in the backline to shore up the crazy amount of goals they conceded. Of course, this being St Kilda, he didn't. Instead, after half the season, he moved to full forward, and became the first true Saints legend.